You never thought the suburban dream would turn into a nightmare. When you moved into that quaint little house with your family, it felt like a fresh start, a safe place to raise your 3 kids. You remember the day you arrived, boxes piled high, the air crisp with the promise of new beginnings. The neighbors waved as you passed by, their smiles warm and welcoming. They said it was the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked. And for a while, it seemed perfect. The house wasn't enormous, but it was a step up from your cramped apartment. Your wife adored the backyard, especially the old, slightly eerie statues scattered among the overgrown plants. You didn't think much of them. "They give the yard character," she said, smiling. You shrugged, already picturing the effort it'd take to maintain the place. But if she was happy, you were happy. The first time you noticed something strange, you brushed it off. One of the statues, an angel you think, was facing away from the house. You could have swear it was turned the other way when you first moved in. "It's nothing," you told yourself. "Just a trick of the memory." After all, moving was chaotic. Who could keep track of every detail? But then, the next morning, another statue had turned. And this time, you were sure it wasn't your imagination. You mentioned it to your wife. She laughed it off, too busy wrangling the kids to give it much thought. "Maybe Jimmy's playing a prank," she said, chuckling. Your oldest, a mischievous boy, always had a knack for stirring up trouble. But when you asked him, he gave you a blank stare. "Dad, why would I move those creepy things?" Good question. A few days later, you looked out the window and froze. All the statues were lined up at the very edge of the garden, facing the house. Their lifeless eyes seemed to bore into you. Your breath hitched. They were too heavy to move. You knew that. You'd tried lifting one before. It wasn't just strange, it was impossible. You didn't want to admit you were scared, but the fear became unavoidable when you found the message. "Go away," spray painted in crude, black letters on the back wall of the house. You rushed your kids inside, heart pounding. Grabbing a kitchen knife, you scoured the garden, shouting threats into the empty air, but no one was there. Only the silence of the statues watching. The worst moment came that night. Your wife's scream pulled you into the living room, where she stood by the window trembling. You grabbed a knife and ran out, adrenaline coursing through your veins. They stopped when they saw you, retreating into the shadows. By the time the police arrived, they were gone. No footprints, no evidence. You installed cameras the next day, no matter the cost. Your wife begged to move, but you couldn't afford it. The cameras worked. Whatever, or whoever, had been tormenting you never came back. But the unease never left. Those faceless figures still haunt your dreams. You still live in that house, the statues still stand in the garden, and the memory of, and you never did figure out what really happened. Sometimes you catch yourself glancing out the window, half expecting to see the statues moved, the masks returned. You've learned to live with the questions, though they'll never let you rest. After all, the scariest horrors aren't the ones we understand. They're the ones we never will. When I bought my first house, I was only 27. After years of saving, it finally felt like I had something to call my own. It wasn't much, just a small, modest place, but it was mine. Adjusting to living alone wasn't easy. I'd grown up in a house full of life, parents, siblings, dogs. Here, the silence was overwhelming. The balcony became my escape, a place to unwind after work, a place where I could think. It was tiny, barely big enough to stand on, but it felt like a luxury. I'd met most of my neighbors except one, the man who lived behind me, or at least I assumed he lived there. The place looked abandoned, but sometimes, late at night, I'd see a light in the upstairs window. One Saturday, I decided to introduce myself, but when the door flew open, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. An elderly woman stood there, staring at me. Her face was expressionless, her eyes wide and intense. That night, as I stepped onto the balcony, I saw her, standing in her yard, dead still, staring right at me. Then came the sock. A single dirty sock on my side of the fence. It was proof. She'd been in my yard. One night, the doorbell started ringing, again and again. I knew who it was before I even looked. When I opened the door, she lunged at me, a knife in her hand. Her face was twisted with rage as she screamed about her son, about how I'd taken him from her. The police arrived and took her away. Even as they forced her into the car, she kept screaming. Her words still echo in my mind. I moved out less than a year later, but the memory of her, it still haunts me. It made me question everything about feeling safe, even in my own home.